Lord, we thank you for this time. Thank you for the chance to reflect. May today be somewhat of an Ebenezer, marking all that you have done, how you have been glorified, how we are following your lead in all that we do. How the center gets to represent that. I pray that this food would bless our bodies, bless our time. And we praise you. We praise your name, Jesus. Thank you for conquering the grave and death, conquering sin, and conquering Satan. That we get to expand your kingdom and work with you from a place of victory. We love you, Jesus. Amen. So today will be somewhat informal, but a chance to reflect on how the center started and get to hear from Professor Brauch, and I'll share as well in our more modern history. But if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to save them for the end, you can. But we just hope this is somewhat informal discussion, but a chance to share our history. So, like I think Lauren started off. Oh yeah, so just as a recap of our kind of main pillars, the Center for Global Justice exists that human rights abuses at home and abroad. We're advancing the rule of law, protecting children, safeguarding religious freedom, and fighting human trafficking.
All right, well, thanks for coming today. I mean, I guess some of you didn't have a choice, right? We made you come, but I hope you'll be glad you came today. As Professor Kelsey said, we just want to remember what God has done in the work of the center. And you mentioned Ebenezer, and I think that's such an important thing. You know, in the Old Testament, so often something would take place. God would do something amazing, and then he would know what people would do. They forget about it, and so he would have them build an altar, or build a pile of rocks, so that the people could tell their kids and their kids' kids what God had done. And that's what I kind of hope today we do, that we can remember what God has done, because I think from beginning until now, the biggest theme about the center has been just God's supervision and superintendence of all that's taken place. And so probably many of you know, here's the picture of the first night we launched the Center for Global Justice in 2010. I don't want to talk about that yet, because 2 years before that, the center really originated before that night, and I want to tell you about what happened before that. So it was fall of 2008, and some of you may know, but it was not a great time in our country. We had the great financial crisis, and so in the fall of 2008, stock market had just crashed. And so there was one day it dropped 7%. That year it dropped between 33, the Dow dropped 33%, and the S&P 38% 1 year, if you can imagine. And that was bad for us here, because at the time the university had a sizable endowment, but was using the endowment for operation. And so what that meant was, rather than just living on tuition dollars and things like that, we needed the endowment. And when the endowment really dropped, the university came to us, and I was dean of the law school at the time, and said, all right, we need you to cut $1.3 million out of your budget now. And that was bad. Because things have been going really well at the law school, and we felt like we were making progress and just really steady, good progress, and it just was a blow. Because where do you find $1.3 million just like this over the course of a few months? And it was a very discouraging time. We really didn't know where we were going to find it, and we knew that it was going to mean we'd have to actually let people go, as well as cut programs. And so this thing is so it was early in, or sometime in November of 2008, and I put the wrong date on it. It says 1208, but it was 11. And so I just decided I needed to go for a walk, and I was just praying and asking God, what do we do? What should we do? And I should tell you that Randy Singer had talked to me not long before this. And Randy had said, You know, Jeff, what you guys really need to do is lean into international law and international justice. We both had talked about how so many students were coming to the school at the time who didn't want to do traditional law practices or corporate law, or be prosecutors. So many were burdened by the things that were on that previous slide, burdened by human trafficking or religious freedom. And so as I was walking and just praying, this is one of those times in my life where I just had this strong sense God was leading us to do something. And it's very rare. I've never heard God's voice audibly, but I just felt strong leading that, you know what, this is the time we need to start a center for, I named it wrong, international justice. And I came back, this paper is, I just came back to the house and I just started typing. And this was what I felt like we should be doing. And what's cool is a lot of it is what stuff that we do now. International internships, more courses, symposium. For a while, the center ran the symposium. We now work with the journal. But all these things I thought were things that God would want us to do. And so I typed this up. And then I came back to the law school and I met with our associate deans. So it was Doug Cook, Professor Cook. He was an associate dean, a guy named Jim Murphy. And so I shared with them a little nervously because our talks up until now have been, all right, where are we going to cut? And what I wanted to tell them was, I think we should actually expand. And the passage that I shared with them was something that's meant a lot to me for a long time. It's out of Numbers chapter 11. People of Israel, as they often did during the Exodus, were whining, grumbling because they didn't have any meat. And so Moses just had a complete meltdown. He goes to God and says, where in the world am I going to get meat for all these people? And God tells him, I'm going to give them meat. And Moses says, where in the world are we going to get meat for all these people? Just kill me now, is what Moses says. And God stops him short and says, is my arm too short? And that's something that I think I and we as deans felt, you know what, God's arm is not too short. And so we decided, you know, we really should start this for a Center for Global Justice. Even if we're cutting elsewhere, we need to do this. And I want to just read you, I was journaling during that time, a fair amount. And I just want to read you a few excerpts from what I wrote. Because for the next few weeks, I started just talking about this, praying about it together. And so I wrote these words. I said, I would have expected this to be a down period, but I've been strongly, divinely energized and encouraged. I really feel like we went through the process in the law school thoughtfully and prayerfully. We were able to make these major cuts, talking about the budget cuts, in a way that still preserves the core. Plus, more and more, I'm looking forward. Everyone I talk to about the Center for International Justice is excited. I can't say for certain, but I believe it's God leading. And if so, he will fund it. And then, just a few words ahead. I'm actually excited about what's ahead. I believe this will be one of the times I look back to someday and see that God was really active in my life, in the school, in a clear way. And I have to tell you that I'm kind of cautious about trying to claim that God told me to do something. There's so many people, you know, how many people claim God's voice and authority to do what they want to do? But I have to say, looking back over many years now, I'm certain of it. As we talk today, for some of the reasons, I really believe it. So let me just share a few things that happened over the next few months after that got us to here, and then we want to talk about where it's gone since. But a couple of really important things happened. Well, one was I just kept talking to people about it. So for a while, for a few months, anybody I could get an audience with, I would just tell them about this idea. And so it was the board of trustees of the university, the president of the university, the board of visitors. And then in the fall of 2009, so this is about 9 months later, I was dean at the time. And so as often happens, I gave the first chapel of the year. And so I was sharing a short-term missions trip that my family and I had gone on that year. But then I decided at the end to just share the vision that we as deans had for the Center for Global Justice, which I think you were calling it at that point. And at the end, I just asked students to pray. So all I wanted was just, would you just pray? Because we still had no money. We were still in a cutting mode at the university. And this young woman came up right after my talk. She's a 1L. She's just started law school. But her name was Ashley Chapman. And some of you have probably seen or heard the play, The Man of La Mancha. The description of Don Quixote is this, that he had eyes burning with the fire of inner vision. That was Ashley. Ashley was all about, she had come to law school. She actually wasn't sure why she was supposed to be in law school, but when she heard that talk, she knew this one. And so she said, all right, I'm in, what do we need to do? And she, I think, single-handedly created the student staff because she got 12 people who were willing to join her. And for the next year, all they did was research what other centers do. They researched foundations where we could maybe get some money. They researched what other schools taught so we could have a robust curriculum in human rights. That was key. And I would say a huge theme of the Center for Global Justice throughout its history is God bringing the right person just when we need them. And we get to Lauren and Sister Kelsey, who I believe came to us in the same way, but Ashley was one of those people then. Then, in the spring of that year, so this is now the spring of 2010, still have no money. A university from overseas contacted us and said, we want our graduates to take an American bar exam. And we think you can help train them. And we realized, well, this is going to generate some tuition revenue for us. And so Jim Murphy, one of our associate deans, said, we should talk to them and talk to the university president and just say, hey, there's money that we could get from this. Let's see if they'd be willing to put it all toward the Center for Global Justice. And the president said, yes. And so all of a sudden we had money. There was a way to start the center. And so I guess the next big event was that summer before we had even launched the center. For what picture is next? It's the insurance, those first 4 interns. Is this one? Yeah. Upper left corner, we decided this is almost the first fruits of the Center for Global Justice. We would send out 4 interns for the first time to represent the Center for Global Justice. You might recognize one of them. It was a very young Ernie Wall. But actually, Chapman is the one in kind of the rosish or pink suit. And we sent out 4 interns. And so it was like the first beginning of the internship program. And then it was that fall. Finally, in October, we had some money. And I'd forgotten this until today. We were just digging back through some of the history. We have law review members here. Anybody in law review? Yeah. Okay. The law review actually hosted a symposium, decided, I think, to help with this vision, to do a symposium on domestic human trafficking. And we decided we were going to launch the center at a fundraising banquet in one of the evenings of the symposium. It was a 2-day symposium. And got about 260 people. We raised more money to use to launch the center. And Linda Smith, who's ex-Sheriff of International, she was our keynote speaker. And hey, that night was so moving. The night that the picture was taken, people wouldn't leave, they would just hang around and talk. People were excited about what God was doing. And that was the night that the center launched. So I don't know, probably ended up me just sharing the beginning of it, but that was the origin. I have to tell you that looking back, it's exciting. It's exciting when you look back in your life, and this is going to sound dumb because God is always with us. I mean, He is always involved in our lives. But there are times when you look back and you say, oh, it was so evident. I I just saw him there in a heightened way, or I observed it in a heightened way, and this is one of those times. And that was kind of the beginning of consent.
Well, we'll go through some of these. This is all of the leadership throughout the years, so. That's Brauch was Dean, with Ashley Chapman. We'll talk a little bit more about alumni and where they are now. Skip Ash, did you want to say anything about him?
Yeah, you would. Yeah, so Skip worked with the American Center for Law and Justice, but he served as kind of a faculty director. Sometimes we had faculty members in those early years serve as executive director. Ashley, in many ways, functioned as the day-to-day director of the center. When Skip was done doing that, then Dave Maloney, Professor Maloney, served as executive director, did for a couple of years. Craig Stern, I don't know if any of you had a chance to have him, he's retired now, but he served as executive director when Ernie Walton came back in 2013 to be the director. So that was his first job, by the way. He came back to the law school to serve as director for the center. And then God just kept expanding his duties until now he's dean. And then a huge development for us, Professor Kelsey came, again, just when we needed her, bringing skills that none of us had ever had before to further expand the mission of the school, to the center.
You see the 4 interns there, and then Lauren helped you some of this. We have had over 230 interns now in 20 different countries and 14 states. So the numbers speak for themselves with the kind of multiplication of what God has done. And the pro bono work we all and you all are doing is valued at millions of dollars of work for legal partners across the globe who are doing such important work but are often understaffed. So we get to provide that support for them. And then the top right, you all may not recognize, that's in next to the dean's offices, which is where the center office used to be, on the 2nd floor. And then y'all want to share?
Sure. Professor Brauch will talk a little bit more about how our relationship in Uganda began, but these 3 bottom pictures, has anyone read Love Does by Bob Goff or Jim Gash's book? Okay, I see some heads nodding. So the remand home that Jim went to in that book, Regent also has worked in that remand home. It's in Naguru, which is outside of Kampala. And that picture is a girl named Heather P. She worked with our nonprofit partners, Chimpizi Child Care Ministries in Uganda. They are basically, if you haven't heard of them, like a one-stop shop, like vigilante prosecutors, police forces. They do everything that would probably not be allowed here in the US, but they're really highly respected and trusted, not just by the Ugandan government, but by people in their communities. And so in this remand home, I think this was in 2011 or 2012, around the same time Jim Gash was working in Naguru to start implementing plea bargaining, which became the prison project, which maybe some of you in here have even participated in that. This was where it started. This was the first remand home that Pepperdine worked in and that Regent students worked in before it was even an official thing. And the picture of the bed on the mat is inside of the remand home. So that's where the juveniles who were being held there, waiting for trial, where they would sleep. And then I mentioned Chimpizi Child Care Ministries. They work to not just prevent, but also to help prosecute child sacrifice in Uganda, and they have a home for those kids who survive being mutilated, essentially. And so Hope was actually the child who really, where all of this work began with, as far as Regent. She was a couple months old when she was found in a bush. She'd been left there to die. And Peter, who is the executive director of KCM, got in touch with the people who had found hope and was brought to them, and he has adopted her, and now she's legally his daughter. And her witch doctor was actually the first witch doctor in Uganda, correct me if I'm wrong, that was prosecuted and given a life sentence in Uganda. Is that right?
Not sure, there was also the story of Alan.
Oh, maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said is right, except I'm not sure this guy was prosecuted.
Okay,
Yeah, but I can tell Alan's story.
yes,
But
yeah.
did you get to see it? You were at this
I never went. I went to NBC, yeah.
Yeah, so I think both of us have had a chance to go here, and it's just an amazing place. Hope, when I got to meet her, I mean, she is severely disabled, but she has this beautiful smile that reflects, I think, the grace of God in her life. The story about how we got involved, this was one of the times when I realized, wow, God really had a huge purpose for our center, was in another child sacrifice case. So there's this young kid, I think he was 6 years old, his name is Alan. And Alan was kidnapped by witch doctors who are going to perform child sacrifice on him. And it's hard to imagine that child sacrifice actually exists still. And it's actually tied now, it's a little more high tech, they tie it to business. So somebody wants to develop a business, they want to start a business. And so that their business will grow and thrive, they will go to a witch doctor and they will actually cut off genitals, which happened to Alan, or cut off other body parts, or kill the child completely. And then they will offer this to the gods in hopes that that will allow their company to thrive. And that happened to Alan. Thankfully, he was found alive. But there were two people who had done this to Alan. And there was a case that went forward over a 3-year period. And then people realized, oh, these guys are back in the village. It's just odd. It's very odd to know. It's not like there was a trial and then there was an acquittal and this was announced. The case just sort of went away. The defendants were freed. And Champisi realized, what is going on? These guys are back in the village. And so they decided, we're going to look into this a little bit more. And Heather Pate, who is our house heel now on the bottom left, she just did a deep dive into the files of this case to find out what happened. And they were able to then get a transcript of what had taken place at the court. Well, 3 years later, another of our interns, Deborah Stieglitz, who was also working for Champisi, she and Peter, running Champisi, went deeply into this transcript and realized there were a lot of procedural errors that took place in this case. And they brought it to the court's attention. And this would not have happened but for the work of Heather and Deborah. And they were retried. And ultimately, it took another 6 years. 2022, these guys were convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Would not have happened but for Heather and Deborah and the center.
And that happened in 2022, final justice, right as I was being hired and hearing about that. And at the time we had a prosecutor from Uganda coming to visit, Rachel Bicole, and Peter has come to visit as well to speak at lunch events. And so we've seen that partnership with Uganda grow. We'll talk about the fellowship as well. And then the journal, the history of the journal.
Yeah, we had an international law journal and a journal of public policy during the first decade of the 2000s. And one of the budget cuts was, we can't have 2 extra journals. So we combined the 2 journals into the journal of, you may wonder why is such a long name. Well, we merged 2 journals. And so it became the Journal of Global Justice and Public Policy. But in many ways, I think because of the start of the center, that journal has had a lot of its focus on human rights issues and international law, as well as some domestic public policy issues. But that's been a great partnership for the center, so that every year there's a symposium that the journal puts on, but that the center participates in. And that's been something to help carry out the vision, I think, from the beginning.
Regent in the rankings, as you all have probably been hearing, Regent Law has been consistently increasing in rankings. And the journal and the Center for Global Justice has played a large part in that, in some of our rankings, not only as a law school, but in public policy as well as human rights law. And we always reiterate, we're not doing this for the rankings, but it is, there are benefits that come from that. And we believe God is glorified when others see we're not just a Christian law school, but we are an excellent Christian law school, and we are equipping excellent advocates. And in fact, those who are Christian should be the most excellent in what we do. And so we get to model that. And so the rankings are, we believe, reflecting what God is doing on this campus, and do draw interest from, you know, other students who might not come or other organizations. There's a level of credibility that does open certain doors for our students.
Yeah, I'd say when that ranking, that especially that #1 in human rights law in the country came out, I laughed. I was so because only God could have done it. There is no way, given the start of this center, that this could have happened, but for God. And there have been a few instances along the way where God's reminded me, and sometimes I'll cry, sometimes I'll just pump my fist, because I think about what God has done. That was one of them. And I know you're going to talk about Olivia's case and the first use of vacatur, but that was another one where I thought, God, thank you for having done this. Alan's case was another one of those times when it was just, only God could have done this, given where the center started from, which I shared.
And one thing, Heather Pate, who worked on Alan's case, is now working in domestic violence cases as a JAG, I believe, in Florida. And she regularly joins our monthly center prayer calls. And so she went before us in, you know, by 10 years, and then now is continuing to invest and connect. And so I get to pray with her every month as she joins to pray over the center. So one more aspect of our connection with Uganda is with UTU, and I'll let, yeah, you want to just talk about a few of them?
Yeah, sure. So one of the really cool moments in the history of the center was when Professor Maloney and I got to go to Uganda for the first time, both of us, and we went to Uganda Christian University, and didn't know at the time that would become an important partner for us, but we just found like-minded people. He and I both got to teach in some classes. It was kind of fun because they had an outdoor classroom, and there were monkeys climbing around in the rafters. So, yeah, I'm trying to teach this very serious material. My wife keeps jumping up and taking pictures of monkeys. But we developed a relationship with them. One summer we had a summer program where some students could spend time and get credits there. But I think the best part of it was that summer, we just met people at Uganda Christian who have now been hosts to fellows. You know, we have a fellow there right now, Alyssa Schiefer, who is being housed at UCU, is partnering with them in their work. We met Mike Chibita, Chief Justice, or Justice now on the Ugandan Supreme Court. Yeah, big guy right there.
He's usually the tallest, but when he's standing with Professor Nate here, it's pretty tall.
Yeah, and this summer of 2012, this is Jim Gash. So those of you who are familiar with Pepperdine and their project, he was just starting in 2012, the prison project in remand homes, doing plea bargaining. And so we got a chance to meet him, get to know him. I think from the beginning, he was a supporter of what we were doing, and it was important for our students then to be able to work with Pepperdine students over the years as part of that program. But Uganda was a place that from the beginning, we just built good connections, and that's led to a lot of internships.
And I had the chance to visit, not this past summer, but the summer before, the see our interns and also had the chance to visit UCU. We didn't yet have a fellow there, but the week I was visiting, Provost William Hathaway also happened to be there. His wife does missions in Uganda. And I'd like to say we planned ahead and coordinated, but we didn't. We just both happened to be there. And so we both got to sit in on meetings with their deans and communicate face to face that we want to, collaborate, coordinate, and support them as a sister Christian university and Christian law school. And so that helped prepare for sending a fellow and kind of building our fellowship program there. And Alyssa is, as Professor Brauch said, living on campus. She's helping with their clinical program, so teaching, and they do community education on land grabbing, so rights for women, children, and widows. And then she also is working 2 days a week with KCM, GMPC from UCU. She's able to go and work with them. So she's having a very meaningful experience there through the connections with UCU that have been long established. And these are former fellows. You want to share about?
Yeah, so that's Chelsea and Pam, and in year 2016 to 2017, they spent a year in Uganda. Pam worked for the International Justice Mission, and Chelsea worked with Champezi, and really another door-opening opportunity where they loved Chelsea's work. And so she got to do a briefing to prosecutors to teach them about how to prosecute child sacrifice cases. And they had actually a special session to address child sacrifice cases during the year that she was there. And so it's just another way that God had opened doors for our students and graduates to be involved on that really important issue.
And Alyssa is on the left here. She got to be in court. Do you want to speak briefly about the case that she was in court?
Yeah, sure. So in Uganda, things, to put it lightly, nothing is urgent, including court. And so sometimes when it can take a really long time for police to investigate a case and several years for the case to be prosecuted as well. And so Alyssa actually got to go with KCM, their head attorney. His name is Yekos. He's standing next to Alyssa in that picture. Has anyone seen Aaron Brockovich? Okay, he is the Aaron Brockovich of Uganda in all child sacrifice cases. He knows every kid that they have at their on campus. He knows their case, what happened to them, how old they are, what's the status. And so Alyssa got to go with him to court to watch the sentencing of a witch doctor who had sacrificed some of this little boy right here. His name is Jesse. I don't know if you can see in the picture, but he's missing an arm and his foot was mutilated in the process. And so she got to witness the judges sentence his attacker and his witch doctor to 40 years in prison, which was a huge win. And so that's some of the things that she's getting to do while she's there. That's his whole family came to court. So it's just really amazing work that she's getting to be a part of, and that kind of helped, Regent got to be a part of that from the beginning and seeing justice be done.
And Lauren served as a fellow in Uganda, and I think helped really open the door and pave the way so that Alyssa could be there and doing the things that she's doing. Yeah, this is one of those that I wish I could tell you more has come from, but Professor Stern and I went to South Sudan in 2013. Some of you may know it's only been a country since 2011. It is the youngest country on earth. And we started meeting with elders of churches, with university leaders, some government leaders, with the thought that we might be able to do some rule of law training there. And we actually had some really good ideas. We were excited about it. And then the civil war began in South Sudan, and really we've not been able to do anything more since then. If you have time later, I can tell you about how We had to basically buy Professor Stern out of South Sudan on the way out of the country. Yeah, but that was that's one of the more scary trips I've ever taken, I have to say. Who knows? Maybe God has something in mind where there'll be fruit from this someday. For now, not yet. Yeah, so one other trip, I had a chance a decade ago to sit in on part of a session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So it's the main human rights enforcement body in Africa. And so I went just to kind of see what was going on. I wanted to get a feeling on the ground there. And one of the really interesting things is for those of you who study human rights, you'll remember this, they really interact well with non-governmental organizations. The commission wants to know that they want to know what people are caring about, what's Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and Advocates International, what do they care about? What are the issues that should be being brought to the surface? And so for the few days ahead of their commission meeting, they have NGOs meet and they talk. And so I crashed the NGO meeting and I sat in on a little session that was focused on the conditions inside prisons. And so I was just there, we were talking about issues that were going on, and then they said, okay, somebody from each group present the findings of the group. And everybody looked at me. So I was on the panel, so I had to present for the prisons group. That's why a guy who doesn't look like he belongs, and in some ways I didn't, why I'm on that table on the right. Yeah. One of the things that's really gratifying to me is alumni. You know, people like you who they come to center events, they do center internships, they're part of the student staff. What happens later? And so on the left, Sarah Breyer, I think many of you probably interact with her. If you've done work with Shared Hope International, she is, let me get her title right. She's a senior director of policy and legislation for Shared Hope. On the right is Kirk Schweitzer. Kirk did a Uganda internship. He is now the chief of staff for a group called Love Justice International. He works out of Cape Town, South Africa, but he works with this group that fights human trafficking. Ashley Chapman continues to work in this field. She runs a center that helps coordinate anti-trafficking efforts called the Alliance for Freedom, Restoration, and Justice. Some of you work with Nkosi. Danny Pinter is a Regent graduate, and actually several others there are Regent graduates. And she's the chief legal officer of Nkosi after having been through the center. Danielle Gallagher, she is a prosecutor with a special victims unit in Pennsylvania. She is very much shaped by her experience in the Center for Global Justice. She sees herself as the voice of victims who have been abused sexually. And she will regularly write me and my wife Becky and saying, hey, I've got this big trial coming up this week. Would you please pray? These witnesses are scared to death to testify. Would you please pray? And then we will find out the outcome and how the people who have done this to the victims are in prison for years. And so, I don't know, it's just really gratifying to see how God is taking our people forward. It's not just the center here, it's the center everywhere.
So I'll shift a little bit to focus slightly more on the clinic, but I joined in 2022, and at that point was able to launch what we now have as the clinic. But as Professor Brauch has already highlighted, things often will start God is moving for years before that ever happens. And so there is a longer timeline for the clinic even started. And so first is just the idea that Virginia has been behind other states, has been behind nationally in developing laws and even addressing human trafficking. So before we'd even contemplated record relief, our center interns were working, even with Governor McDonnell at the time, on a law that helped make sure that law enforcement was trained to prosecute with or without victim cooperation. So it's important that if you're fully relying on the victim, then that can be complicated. And so if there are other ways to develop prosecution, investigation of human trafficking, that frees up kind of the burden on the victim in that. And so kind of the early connections of the center with this topic came just through interacting with the governor at the time. And then in 2015, Virginia finally passed a standalone human trafficking law. We were the last state to pass a law that specifically exclusively addressed human trafficking. Before that time, prosecutors had to piece together, prosecuting under abduction or some form of solicitation. And so we had that law passed, but then there was a lingering problem. And Dean Walton, who at the time was director of the center, was not yet our dean, wrote a white paper about this issue that survivors, as they're being victimized, are often forced to commit crimes by their trafficker. And then even when they break free, when they're trying to rehabilitate, trying to move on with their lives, have this burden of a criminal record. And so it had not been addressed in Virginia. And so as an academic, he submits, this white paper in collaboration with Virginia Coalition Against Human Trafficking, which is a group of stakeholders in Virginia. It's taken different forms, but the center has been involved with them for many years. So he writes that in 2019, and then 2 years later, the law passes. Virginia Vacatur Law passes. And in the middle, in the white tank top, you can see Olivia, who becomes our first client. But the law that passed, there was a success that it passed, but it was very limited. And it only allowed 2 types of misdemeanors to be cleared from a record. So prostitution and body place is what it's called in Virginia, or being in a place of prostitution. And so while it was a victory, it was very narrow, but that was the law we had. And so the law passed in 2021. Meanwhile, I was able to join the center in fall of 2022 as the assistant director, and started just kind of learning the ropes of the center. And another kind of God story, God intervention was a partner from Troutman Pepper reached out and been in touch with Dean Walton and Professor Brauch, saying, we want to offer pro bono hours to the center. Basically, we have this resource we want to offer, have our attorneys support something. What would that look like? And I also found out that it had been a desire to start a clinic within the center. Do you know, like from the beginning, was that an idea?
It was within the first year. We put together a case statement, and the clinic shows up in here. Yeah, it wasn't
So was
exactly
that
the same. This was before we launched. So this was 2009.
I'm
or
learning
early
a lot about the center today. So I realized when we sat down, when I joined the center, I was just kind of off and running. And so I've learned bits and pieces of the history, but today probably I will benefit more than anyone else to learn our history and all that Professor Brauch and others have done. So when I joined the we had the support of Troutman, and then just started to brainstorm, if we were to start a clinic, what would we do? And I researched similar to what it sounds like Ashley Chapman and that team did. Speaking with clinics all over the country, and clinics that focus on either directly representing trafficking survivors or related areas of law. And it was very eye-opening. It was a sobering time of research. Even though this is kind of human trafficking is kind of hot button topic, everyone is talking about it. There have been a lot of good intentions with not great follow-up, and one clinician specifically kind of discredited because we were a Christian institution of like, oh, the churches want to get involved and then they mess things up, basically was the message of good intentions, but not having the expertise. And so she said, if you do anything, start small and follow through with what you say you're going to offer. And so Dean Walton pointed out the white paper he had worked on and the law that had passed. And so as I researched that, I realized that's great, the law passed, but not a single petition had been filed for 2 years. And so realized with our involvement, and then as a prosecutor, I've been a prosecutor in Norfolk, had worked on record relief type petitions, had that experience. And so it all began to line up of, this is what we can do. This is the piece of the puzzle that we can bring if we're to launch a clinic. And the next part was to find a client who's gonna be kind of the guinea pig of like, as we're launching and figuring out what to do. And through VCAT, the Virginia Coalition Against Human Trafficking, connected with a stakeholder who recommended Olivia for a number of reasons. First, she was involved in actually getting the Vacatur law passed. She had testified and shared her story, and she had told her story before and is just very strong, emotionally strong, and in a more stable place, had steady work and kind of family life. And so she agreed to be the pioneer, and we worked through a lot of kinks with her being our first client to file that petition. And there was a lot of strategy kind of deciding where to file and all of that, but her petition was the first one ever granted. One thing to note is that she agreed to go through the process, even though the law was very narrow, and even though it only cleared a small portion of her record. So it really wasn't going to give her the full benefit, but she saw the value in going through the process, being the first one and helping others through it. So through our experience with the petition, we were then asked to co-chair a working group to discuss and work on an expansion for the law to kind of catch up with what other states were doing. And so another God intervention was the working group in the past had really stalled, that we weren't getting, VCAT was not getting kind of the influential people to the table. And when they asked us to co-chair, and in part that was because some prosecutors that I had worked with agreed to come if I was part of the working group, just because of the credibility of having been a prosecutor. And so that's kind of part of my experience in history. Only God knew kind of what the resume bullet points would matter to some people. And so because we were the co-chairs, law enforcement joined, prosecutors joined, defense attorneys joined, representatives from the attorney generals, we were able to all sit around a large table, literally sit at the table together. And Olivia shared her story and other survivors shared their stories. It was the first time that some of those folks had directly spoken with survivors. You can imagine how impactful that was. And so that began to build momentum, just face to face. We're all humans and humanizing kind of the experience. And so in 2025, the law was expanded in this past year, July 2025, from 2 offenses to then 1 felony, drug possession, and 33 other offenses. So the enumerated list expanded greatly. While doing this work in the legislative work group, we realized Olivia's story is powerful, but when we're talking to lawmakers, we need more than just anecdotes of like, here's the story, and this will really pull you at your heartstrings. We needed numbers and data. And so in searching, Polaris is an organization, they ran a human trafficking hotline, they have some data, other organizations, but there really wasn't anything recent that covered what we needed. And so then that led to kind of a prompting of the Lord to consider launching our own research project. And some of our staff on the project are here. And that's one that I've told the Lord if I knew all that was involved, I probably would not have said yes. But it's been a neat experience to expand into the type of research. Most of our research is looking through legislation, case law, traditional legal primary sources. And so to expand to research where human beings are the subject, which is what we're doing with surveys, is very different. And so that was, we had approval, and Professor Brauch is on, there's an institutional review board in our university to review, to oversee that type of research. which I didn't know existed until I started this project. And so he was helpful even helping shape that proposal. Then we had success last year with the law, Lauren, but so we had momentum going into this General Assembly this past January. And so I was asked to revisit my role as chair of that work group, along with another survivor, as we focused on a few different priorities, but continuing with Baker. And the law that has passed, and as long as the governor doesn't veto next week, which we don't expect will happen, it will expand significantly. Not only it will cover all misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies. So instead of a list, it is categories of offenses. And whenever there are a couple things with the cases that often, well, there are 2 times that I felt like I made a mistake or we took a misstep and then God has used it for his glory. And one was a case that was pending while we were in discussion with legislators. And it was actually Olivia's case in Chesapeake, where we had filed everything, but the prosecutor was really giving us a hard time and contesting, even though she had already had petitions granted. She's been determined a victim. This prosecutor was really giving us a hard time. And so we talked about this as a clinic course and kind of second guessing, did we not file a third enough petition? What are we getting wrong with the evidence? And it turns out that because that specific prosecutor was giving us such a hard time while we were in discussions with legislators, we got to share that and got 2 different elements included in the law that would not have previously been inserted. And one is a rebuttable presumption. So because we told this kind of horror story of like, we know this isn't common, but this is what one prosecutor is contesting, even though we have very thorough evidence. So now the law has a rebuttable presumption. If the survivor can file a petition with official documentation, and we got to define that, the official documentation has a fairly broad definition, then it will establish that this person is a victim. So the rebuttable presumption means the case has been established, the evidence has been established, and it's up to the prosecutor, and that's a very high burden for them to overcome. Not only a rebuttable presumption as to victim status, but also if they have official documentation as to the proximate cause, the trafficking was the proximate cause of acquiring this conviction, then it establishes a prima facie case. So it's not quite a rebuttable presumption, but it's much better than it was. And so those were 2 huge wins that I never would have thought we'd get in the law, but it was because we had this really challenging case that I thought, this shouldn't be this hard. Why is it this hard? Why is this person contesting? And now, I want to thank that prosecutor because you were impossible. We got this included in the law.